Section 1. The Ghost in the Hallways of History. There is a name, spoken in hushed tones across the great halls and cold keeps of Westeros, that carries more weight than almost any other name in that whole vast, war-scarred, blood-soaked world. It is not the name of a king. It is not the name of a conqueror. It is not the name of a man who sat upon the Iron Throne or commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the field. It is the name of a knight. Just a knight by the narrow political accounting of his era. And yet, when this name is spoken by the people who mattered most in the world of Game of Thrones, when it falls from the lips of hardened lords who have survived decades of civil war, battle-scarred veterans who have stared death in the face more times than they could count, men who were themselves considered among the finest fighters of any generation, it produces something remarkable, something that looks almost uncomfortably close to reverence, something that sounds less like professional respect, and more like the quiet awe a craftsman might feel standing in the shadow of a master, whose work they will spend their entire life trying to equal. That name is Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning. Think carefully about what that name meant to the people in the world of Game of Thrones who knew it, not as historical curiosity, not as distant legend, but as a real measurement, a standard, a bar set somewhere so high in the sky that most people who aspired to it could not even see where it ended. Jaime Lannister. Consider Jaime for a moment, because Jaime Lannister is one of the best arguments this story ever makes for individual human greatness. At his peak, before the tragedy at Harrenhal stole what made him singular, Jaime was almost certainly the most dangerous person alive in Westeros with a sword in their hand. Ser Barristan Selmy himself, a man of such legendary personal bravery and skill that enemy commanders at the Battle of the Trident refused to kill him because of the waste it would represent, acknowledged that Jaime was the finest natural swordsman he had seen in a very long time. Jaime was the kind of fighter whose presence on a battlefield changed the mathematics of survival for everyone around him, the kind of person who made other skilled warriors nervous simply by entering the same room. He was arrogant, brilliant, and almost certainly had a right to both. Jaime Lannister, in describing Sir Arthur Dayne, said that Arthur could have killed 5 Kingsguard members, including Loras Tyrell, who was the finest young knight of his generation, the so-called Knight of Flowers, with his left hand while he was occupied with something considerably less dignified using his right. That is the kind of statement you do not make about someone you simply respected. That is the kind of statement you make when you encountered someone who broke your understanding of what a human being was capable of, and you have spent years afterward trying to find words adequate to the experience. Jaime said this to a room full of people who were supposed to represent the finest fighters in the realm, and he said it not as boasting on Arthur's behalf, but as a way of instructing them about the gap between what they were and what a knight was supposed to be. Barristan Selmy, the old knight who served Lengir and more faithfully than perhaps any other person in the history of the Kingsguard, a man who had known kings and princes and warriors across 5 decades of active service. When he thought of Arthur Dayne, he thought of him as a peer. More than a peer, actually. Someone who operated at the same extraordinary height as Barristan himself, with the advantage of a blade that turned any comparison in Arthur's favor before it could even begin. George R.R. Martin himself, when pressed on the question, said that Arthur Dayne with Dawn would beat Barristan Selmy, and that without the sword it would be too close to call. The author of the series, given the full spectrum of every great fighter who ever lived in the story, would choose Arthur Dayne as his champion in trial by combat. That is how highly he sat in the assessment of the person who created him. And then there is Ned Stark, quiet, honorable, deeply measured Eddard Stark of Winterfell, a man whose defining characteristic was his bone-deep commitment to truth, a man incapable of comfortable lies even when comfortable lies would have saved his life. Ned Stark called Arthur Dayne the finest knight he ever saw. Not the finest he ever fought, not the finest of his era, not the finest he had heard about. The finest he ever saw. Full stop. And then he added the detail that puts the whole thing into devastating perspective. He said that Arthur Dayne would have killed him, would have ended his life right there in the dust and heat of Dorne with that pale blade in hand, if not for the intervention of Howland Reed. Ned Stark. The man who came home from the Tower of Joy. The man who survived. Looking back on the encounter not with triumph or the satisfaction of a man who overcame a great challenge, but with something quieter and more complex. The somber acknowledgement that he was alive because of luck and the bravery of a small man from the neck, and that the greatest knight he ever saw was dead because that small man stabbed him from behind when the sword of the morning believed him neutralized. There is a whole universe of meaning in that. There is heartbreak in it, and tragedy, and philosophical complexity about the nature of honor and duty, and what it means to be the best at something in a world that does not always reward excellence with appropriate endings. And all of that is what we are going to unpack tonight. We are going to trace the complete, deep, layered story of Sir Arthur Dayne from the very beginning, not just from his own life, but from the ancient roots of the house that made him. We will walk the volcanic shores of Dorne, where House Dayne first planted its roots 10,000 years ago, before recorded history, when the world was new and the children of the forest were still living in the forests of Westeros. We will hold the sword, dawn up to the light, and try to understand what a blade made from a fallen star actually means, both practically and in terms of the mythology of this world. We will follow Arthur as he rises from the second son of a Dornish lord to the most respected member of the most prestigious brotherhood of warriors in the realm. We will stand beside him in the Kingswood as he solves a problem that armies had failed to solve, and watch him duel the most dangerous outlaw in the Seven Kingdoms with a grace that turned violence into something almost like art. We will trace his friendship with Rhaegar Targaryen, the bond that ultimately led him to his death, with the care it deserves. We will wrestle with the question of why the greatest knight alive sat out most of the war that ended the dynasty he served. And we will be there, at that small round tower in the northern Red Mountains of Dorne, on the day that 7 men approached 3, and only 2 walked away, and everything changed. This is the story of the most overpowered Kingsguard who ever wore the white cloak. This is the story of the standard by which every sword in Westeros was ultimately measured. This is the story of Sir Arthur Dayne, and it begins not with a man, but with a falling star. If you are watching this for the first time, and this kind of slow, deep, immersive exploration of Game of Thrones lore is the kind of thing that speaks to you, drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from, and what time it is where you are right now. There is something genuinely special about the idea of people in dozens of different countries, across different time zones and different stages of their days, all sitting down in the quiet and losing themselves in the same story together. Please subscribe if you haven't already, because there are so many more of these journeys ahead of us. Now, let's begin. Section 2. The Ancient House of Dayne. 10,000 Years of Starfall. To understand Arthur Dayne fully, not just the fighter, not just the legendary white sword, but the complete person, you have to understand the foundation he was built on. And that foundation is one of the oldest and most remarkable in the entirety of Westeros. House Dayne of Starfall does not simply have a long history. House Dayne is history, in the most literal and uncompromising sense of that word. Their story stretches back over 10,000 years, to a period so ancient that the records blur into myth and the myths blur into something that might be the most primitive memory of a people trying to make sense of their own origins. The Daynes belong to the category of houses that scholars of Westerosi history sometimes call First Men aristocracy, families whose lineage traces back to the original wave of human migration into Westeros, those ancient people who crossed the land bridge from Essos in the Dawn Age and gradually spread across the continent, displacing the children of the forest, fighting the others in the long night, building the rough civilization that would eventually produce the Seven Kingdoms, and all the complicated political structures that followed. These are the original noble bloodlines of Westeros. They predate the Andal invasion by thousands of years. They predate even the most ancient records kept in the Citadel. They go back to a time when the history of the continent is kept not in ink on vellum, but in stone carvings and oral tradition and the long memory of the weirwood trees. Of all these ancient houses, the Daynes of Starfall are among the most interesting and the most genuinely mysterious. Their founding story is one of the great mythic origin tales of the Westerosi world, and it has that particular quality that the best origin stories have. It does not feel made up. It feels like the kind of thing that is remembered because it happened, even if the specific details have been worn smooth by the passage of millennia. The story goes like this. The first Dayne, some unnamed ancestor standing at the beginning of the family's genealogical record, followed a falling star, a light in the sky, the kind of celestial event that must have been terrifying and wonderful to a person living in the ancient world, with no framework for understanding it. A streak of fire across the heavens, descending, getting larger, and landing somewhere in the direction of the southern coast. Most people, witnessing something like that, would have regarded it with awe and then gone back to their lives. The first Dayne followed it. He tracked the path of that descending star across the landscape until he found it at the mouth of a river called the Torrhen, where that fast and violent river broadens and slows as it approaches the summer sea. And there, on a rocky island at the river's mouth, where the falling light had come to rest, he found a stone with magical properties, a piece of the sky brought to earth. On that island he built his house. He raised his family there. His descendants inherited the island and eventually built on it what would become Starfall, the ancestral castle of House Dayne, named for the exact event that brought the family to that spot in the first place. The castle has stood in various forms for 10,000 years, those pale tours watching the mouth of the Torrhen pour into the summer sea, keeping their long watch over the generations. Even at the time of Game of Thrones, when the castle we might visit would look nothing like whatever rough structure the first Dayne built. The name is the same, Starfall, the place where a star fell. The memory of that founding moment built into the very name of the place, so that nobody who ever lived there could forget that something extraordinary happened at the beginning of their family's story. The early Danes were not just lords, they were kings. This is crucial context that often gets lost when people focus only on Arthur's and his era. In the ancient political geography of Dorne, before Nymeria's war unified the peninsula under House Martell, the Danes ruled the western mountains as kings of the Torrhen and lords of Starfall. They were among the 3 or 4 most powerful dynasties in ancient Dorne, alongside the Fowlers and the Ironwoods, who were themselves among the most powerful houses in the region's long history. The kingdom that the Danes held was not a vast empire sprawling across the continent, but it was genuinely theirs, ancient territory controlled by ancient bloodlines, with all the accumulated weight of tradition and identities that comes from centuries of continuous rule over the same land. Understanding this matters because it means Arthur Dayne was not born into an ordinary knightly family. He was born into a house that had been royalty, a family whose ancestors had sat on thrones that no longer existed, had wielded powers that had been surrendered through the political processes of Dornish history, but never fully forgotten. When you come from a family like that, when the history of your house stretches back to a time before the kingdoms whose politics currently define your world even existed, you carry that differently than a family that simply acquired wealth and land through service and fortune over a few generations. You carry it in the way you hold yourself, in the stories that are told at your table, in the weight of expectation that falls on every child born with your family's name. The Danes' physical characteristics are worth noting because they speak to the genuine antiquity and distinctiveness of the family. Dorne is, as most Game of Thrones fans know, a land of remarkable internal diversity. The salty Dornishmen of the eastern coasts carry heavy Rhoynar ancestry from Princess Nymeria's Great Migration, and they tend toward olive or darker complexions, dark hair, dark eyes. The sandy Dornishmen of the deep interior deserts are similarly dark, shaped by their environment. But the stony Dornishmen of the western Red Mountains, to which region the Danes belong, have a different look entirely, lighter in many pures, with features that distinguish them from their neighbors. And the Danes specifically are famous for their eyes, purple eyes, violet shades that have absolutely nothing to do with Valyrian bloodlines. House Dayne predates the Valyrian freehold by thousands of years and has no known connection to it, and which represent one of those biological mysteries that the world of Westeros occasionally throws at you. Some deep quirk of the family's specific ancient genetics producing a trait that looks almost magical, even in a world where magic is real. The political history of House Dayne took its definitive turn during what Dornish history calls Nymeria's War. When the Rhoynar queen Nymeria arrived from Essos 10,000 years ago, with her people packed into 10,000 ships, one of the most extraordinary mass migrations in the history of the known world, and began her campaign to unify Dorne under the banner of House Martell, the old kingdoms fell one by one. The last king of the Torrhen was a man named Vorian Dayne, who history remembers by the arresting title of the Sword of the Evening. That title is a direct counterpoint to the Sword of the Morning, that Arthur would one day carry, and what it implies. A darker mirror image of the house's most prestigious honorific is worth sitting with. Vorian was defeated by Nymeria's forces and sent to the wall as part of his surrender. But here is what the Danes did that speaks well of them. They accepted the result. They swore their swords to House Martell and became loyal bannermen rather than continuing to fight a war that was clearly lost. The Fowlers and Ironwoods continued to resist for longer, at greater cost to their people. The Danes made the pragmatic assessment that survival in service to a new order was preferable to annihilation in defense of an old one. This was not cowardice. This was the wisdom of a very old family that had seen empires come and go and understood that the continuity of the bloodline and the tradition mattered more than the specific political arrangements of any given era. And Nymeria, recognizing quality when she saw it, rewarded that acceptance appropriately. Her third husband, after the deaths of her first two Dornish husbands in the Wars of Unification, was Ser Davos Dayne, himself a Sword of the Morning. This is fascinating. The queen who had just defeated the last king of the Torrentine and stripped House Dayne of its royal title, then married a Dayne knight, bearing the family's most prestigious personal honorific. The symbolism seems deliberate, a way of integrating the old Dayne prestige into the new Dornish political order, of honoring the ancient family while making clear that the age of the Torrentine kings was over. From that point forward, through all the thousands of years of Dornish history, the Danes maintained their position as one of the most important houses in the region, not as kings, but as lords of consequence, with all the weight of their extraordinary lineage behind them. Through the Targaryen conquest, through Dorne's long resistance and eventual peaceful integration into the Seven Kingdoms, through the dance of politics and war that defined the centuries leading up to Robert's rebellion, the Danes of Starfall endured, keeping their pale Kossul at the river's mouth, keeping their ancestral sword in its tower, keeping the tradition alive, waiting for the next knight worthy enough to carry the title that had rested on the best and brightest of their number since the world was new. There is one additional historical figure worth mentioning before we leave this ancient survey, because they illuminate the breadth of the Dayne legacy. King Samwell Dayne, known in the historical record as the Starfire, was ancient even by the standards of this ancient house. He was the Dayne king who once burned the city of Oldtown, one of the oldest and greatest cities in Westeros, to the ground. This happened so long ago that the event exists in the space between history and legend, but it speaks to a particular kind of terrifying power that certain Danes could access when they were fully unleashed. The Starfire was not a gentle or peaceful figure. He was the kind of king who scorched a major city from existence, who operated at a scale of violence that made empires nervous. The family that produced Arthur Dayne, with all his chivalry and honor and careful restraint, also produced the Starfire. The Danes are not one-dimensional. They carry within their long history both the blade of the morning and the fire of the evening, and the character of each individual is a matter of which aspect of that heritage they choose to embody. Arthur chose the morning. Section 3. Dawn. The blade born from the heart of a fallen star. Before we can properly discuss Arthur Dayne the fighter, the Kingsguard, the friend, and the tragic figure, we need to spend serious time with the sword, because dawn is not merely a weapon. It is an object of such mythological density, such accumulated significance across thousands of years of use and legend and careful preservation, that it functions almost like a character in its own right. To understand what Arthur was, you have to understand what he was carrying. Let us start with the physical reality, because this matters more than people sometimes give it credit for. Dawn is a great sword, not a long sword, not a hand-and-a-half bastard sword, but a proper greatsword. In the books comparable in size to Ice, the great Valyrian steel blade of House Stark, the sword that Ned Stark carried, and that was later melted down by Tywin Lannister and reforged into two separate blades. Ice is described as a weapon that requires both hands to wield effectively, a sword of serious weight and reach that creates different tactical considerations than a lighter weapon. Dawn shares this scale, which means that everything we know about Arthur Dayne, the effortless grace, the speed, the ability to kill multiple opponents in rapid succession, was accomplished with a very large sword in hand. That is not a minor detail. The blade of dawn is described consistently as pale as milk glass. This is one of those phrases that once you encounter it, you cannot dislodge from your mind, because it is so specific and so evocative. Not silver, not white. Milk glass. That opaque, slightly translucent warm white that is soft rather than bright, substantial rather than flashy. The color of something that has been through fire and come out transformed. And in certain lights, in certain conditions, the blade seems to hold light rather than simply reflect it. Ned Stark's description of the sword in his fever dream uses the phrase alive with light, which reads less like poetic exaggeration and more like the careful observation of a man trying to describe something he literally saw. A pale blade that seems to generate its own faint luminescence in certain conditions. Not a torch, not a fire, something more like the way starlight behaves, present and faint and beautiful, and somehow not quite of the world in which you're standing. This is, almost certainly, the result of its composition. The fallen star at the founding of Starfall was almost certainly a meteorite, a piece of space rock that survived the burning descent through the atmosphere and landed near the mouth of the Torrentine. And meteorites are genuinely remarkable objects in ways that matter for understanding Dawn. The iron in a meteorite is fundamentally different from iron ore pulled from the Earth. It forms under conditions of extreme pressure and temperature that are unachievable in any earthly environment, forged in the most literal possible sense, in the violent death of stars and the cosmic collisions of planetary formation. The crystal structure of meteoritic iron, the Widmanstätten patterns that appear when you cut and etch a meteorite's surface, are unique to this material and cannot be replicated through any known terrestrial metallurgical process. Ancient cultures across the real world understood this intuitively, even without the scientific framework to explain it. Meteoritic iron was sacred in dozens of civilizations, precisely because it came from somewhere else, from the sky, from outside the ordinary world. The ancient Egyptians forged ritual daggers from it. The Inuit of the Arctic worked meteoritic iron long before they had access to conventional iron ore. Many of the earliest swords in human history were made from this material before iron smelting was developed, precisely because the sky gave you iron already mostly ready to work if you could find where it landed. In the world of Westeros, the Danes found theirs, and they used it. The pale, milk glass appearance of Dawn is almost certainly a result of the specific crystalline microstructure of the meteoritic iron, that distinctive look of metal that was shaped by cosmic forces rather than earthly ones. The strength and sharpness that scholars and warriors who examine it consistently describe as comparable to Valyrian steel is a result of the same origin. Valyrian steel achieved its properties through a combination of extreme metallurgy and magical processes that were lost with the Doom. Dawn achieved its properties through a completely different process, through the natural cosmic forging that produced the meteorite, and through whatever craft the first Dayne smiths brought to working it. The result is a blade that is not Valyrian steel, but shares its essential properties, through an entirely different route to the same destination. What remains unknown, and what the scholars of Westeros have been debating for centuries, is whether any magic was involved in Dawn's creation, and if so, what kind. The Danes have been connected to magic in various ways throughout their history. The founding stone with its magical properties, the unusual eye color that might be a remnant of some ancient magical exposure, the extraordinary quality of the sword itself. The connection to the fallen star could be purely metallurgical, a matter of having access to exceptional raw material, or it could be something more. The world of ice and fire is a place where the boundary between exceptional material reality and genuine magic is often deliberately unclear. There is one theory about Dawn that deserves careful consideration, because if it is correct, it transforms the sword from a remarkable ancestral weapon into one of the deep mythological objects of the entire setting. The theory is that Dawn may be Lightbringer, or at least the sword from which the legend of Lightbringer was drawn. Azor Ahai, the hero whose story sits at the heart of the Lord of Light religion, is said to have forged a sword of burning light to defeat the Great Other and end the long night. This sword, Lightbringer, is described as a blade that shines with the brightness of the sun, that carries in its metal the captured heat of summer and the light of dawn. A weapon meant to pierce the darkness and the cold at the moment of the world's greatest need. Dawn is a sword made from a fallen star that carries light in its metal, and is borne by knights who carry the title Sword of the Morning. The symbolism is almost too direct. The Red Priests of Erholor have been looking for the reincarnation of Azor Ahai, the prince who was promised, the person destined to take up Lightbringer again. Meanwhile, there sits a pale blade at starfall, waiting for someone worthy to carry it, having been dormant for a generation, whether George Yar. Martin intends this connection to be real within the world, whether Dawn truly is the mythological object at the center of one of the series' deepest mysteries, or whether it is a deliberate parallel that illuminates the mythology without being the literal truth of it. That is a question the unwritten books may eventually answer. What we can say is that the connection is there, it is not accidental, and thinking about it changes the weight of everything that Arthur Dayne carried on his back. Now, consider the social and cultural significance of Dawn specifically in terms of how the title was awarded. Most ancestral swords in Westeros pass from Lord to eldest heir. Longclaw goes to the Lord Commander of House Mormont. Ice went to the Lord of Winterfell. Heartsbane to the Lord of Horn Hill. These swords are inheritance, passed along bloodlines like land and title, with no particular consideration for whether the current holder is worthy of the honor. The result, inevitably, is that some holders of these famous blades are not really equal to what they're carrying. Dawn operates on a completely different principle. It does not go to the heir. It does not go to the current lord. It goes to the knight of House Dayne who is deemed worthy. And if no such knight exists, if the house produces no one in the current generation who meets whatever standard the family applies, the title lies dormant and the sword stays in its tower. This is an astonishingly demanding system. It means that at any given moment, House Dayne might have no sword of the morning at all, might have a generation or more of good and capable knights who are nonetheless not considered worthy of the title. It places honor and quality absolutely above inheritance and bloodline convenience. Think about what this means for Arthur Dayne specifically. Before him, the title had been dormant. The house had gone through an entire period, possibly a long one, without a knight worthy of Dawn. And then Arthur came along, demonstrated whatever he demonstrated through his life and character and accomplishments, and the house made its collective judgment. This man, give him the sword, he is worthy. The fact that the title has been dormant again since Arthur's death, that no Dayne knight in an entire generation following him has been deemed worthy, that tells you something about the bar he set. The family that holds this impossibly demanding standard, that withholds its greatest honor from generation after generation of knights, rather than compromise, looked at Arthur Dayne and said, yes. And then since his death, they have looked at everyone who came after and said, not yet. That is the sword Arthur carried into every battle. That is what was slung across his back at the Tower of Joy. Not just a pale blade of exceptional material, the weight of 10,000 years of House Dayne history, the trust of a family that compromises on nothing, the silent judgment of every sword of the morning who came before, and the knowledge that he was the last person in the world currently worthy of it. Section 4, The Making of a Legend, Early Life, Character, and the Path to the White Cloak. Arthur Dayne was born into the world of Starfall in or before 260 AC, the second son of Lord Beric Dayne. His birth order is significant, though perhaps not in the way you might expect. Being the second son of a noble house in Westeros placed you in a curious position, free from the direct weight of succession and inheritance, but also without the guaranteed security of a lord's title waiting for you. Second sons made their own paths, through the Maester's chain, through the faith, through mercenary work, or most commonly and most ambitiously, through knighthood. For a Dayne's second son, born into a family whose entire identity was organized around the figure of the greatest knight, the path was essentially written before he was old enough to pick up a training sword. He had older siblings, a brother who would eventually become lord, and sisters, including the remarkable Ashara Dayne, whose own story becomes tragically entangled with Arthur's legacy, and Illyria Dayne, who appears only at the edges of the record. The Dayne family picture that emerges from the fragmentary sources is of a family with genuine depth of character. Ashara is described by those who knew her as a woman of extraordinary beauty and charm and intelligence, someone who made serious men stop what they were doing and reassess the room the moment she entered it. If Arthur's sister was that kind of person, it says something about the quality of the family that produced them both. The training Arthur received from childhood would have been exceptional even by the standards of a noble Dornish house. Dorne has a distinctive martial tradition that emphasizes technical sophistication, flexibility, and adaptability over brute force and direct confrontation. The Dornish way of fighting, shaped by the geography of their home, by centuries of defending rocky mountain passes and desert terrain against larger and more numerous enemies. The greatest Dornish fighters tend to be creative and unpredictable, comfortable with unconventional approaches, skilled at finding the angle their opponents are not expecting. Prince Oberyn Martell is the most vivid example from the main story, a man who fought with a poisoned spear in a style that looked almost more like dance than combat, who came close to defeating a man twice his size, who was almost impossible to hurt by any conventional means. Arthur Dayne combined this Dornish technical tradition with something else, a physical size and strength that is consistently noted across the accounts of him. Jaime Lannister specifically remembered that Arthur was stronger than he was, not just more skilled, stronger. This matters because Jaime Lannister was not a small or weak man. He was tall and physically powerful, trained from childhood, kept in peak condition by the demands of his Kingsguard service. When Jaime says Arthur was stronger, he means genuinely, physically stronger, the kind of advantage that, combined with superior technique, created something close to an insurmountable combination. The exact timeline of Arthur receiving the title Sword of the Morning is not clearly established in the surviving records. What we know is that at some point before the events of the major campaigns we can pin down, he was deemed worthy. The sword came off the wall, the title passed from dormancy into living hands. And the world was given something it had not had in some time, a Sword of the Morning, who was also a member of the Kingsguard, who was also the closest friend of the Crown Prince, who was also about to become the most talked about knight in the Seven Kingdoms. His entry into the Kingsguard itself would have required the recommendation of someone with the standing to propose a candidate, and the approval of the king himself. Given Arthur's extraordinary reputation and the prestige of House Dayne, neither of these would have been difficult to secure. The Kingsguard of Aerys II, whatever its ultimate failures as an institution, was at this point still composed of remarkable individuals. Gerald Hightower, the White Bull, served as Lord Commander and was both physically formidable and politically experienced. Prince Lewin Martell of Dorne brought the sophisticated fighting tradition of his homeland into the Brotherhood, and the fact that both Lewin and Arthur served simultaneously meant the Kingsguard of this era had an unusually strong Dornish influence, which is interesting context. Barristan Selmy, Ser Jonathor Dari, Ser Oswell Went, these were genuine fighters, not ceremonial holders of a prestigious position. When Arthur Dayne joined this company, he raised the average quality of the institution considerably, and those within it who were paying attention knew it. When Barristan Selmy reflected later on, the knights he had served beside in his long career, the generation of Aerys II's Kingsguard in particular, he spoke of it as a kind of golden era, a time when the white cloak had been worn by men genuinely worthy of it, before the rot that he watched accumulate under Robert's reign. The Kingsguard of the generation just before the rebellion had, by the testimony of those who knew it from the inside, been something real and meaningful, and Arthur Dayne was the brightest point of light in it. The question of what Arthur was like as a person, beyond the martial legend, beyond the white cloak and the pale sword, is one that the sources approach obliquely but consistently. The same qualities come up again and again across different accounts from different perspectives. Honesty, a deep sense of what was right and what was wrong, genuine concern for people who had no power, the small folk, the ordinary people who were so easily overlooked by the lords and knights of this world, the kind of man who, when he found himself in a position of power over others, thought about how to use that power carefully rather than carelessly, the kind of man who, in the middle of a military campaign, paid for the food and fodder his forces consumed from the local population rather than simply requisitioning it, because he understood that these were people's livelihoods and they deserved to be treated with respect. This is rare. This is genuinely rare in any world. The capacity for excellence and violence combined with genuine, functional, consistent moral consideration for other people is not a natural combination. Most warriors of any era operate with a certain amount of ethical insulation from the consequences of what they do, a separation between their personal identity and the harm their profession causes. Arthur Dayne seems to have lacked that separation. He was aware, in an ongoing way, of what his power meant for the people around him, and he tried to use it responsibly. The effect that this had on his reputation among ordinary people was remarkable. The Sword of the Morning was not just feared, he was genuinely admired. The small folk of the areas where he operated had a positive opinion of him, which, in the Westeros of Game of Thrones, where the relationship between the powerful and the powerless was often brutally extractive, is no small thing. This was a man that common people looked up to, who inspired something in them beyond the crude respect born of fear. He had earned the more complicated and precious thing, which is trust. Section 5. The Kingswood Brotherhood. How the finest knight solved an impossible problem. The campaign against the Kingswood Brotherhood is one of those episodes in the Game of Thrones historical record that gets fewer pages than it deserves because it reveals so much about Arthur Dayne's character and action. Not Arthur as legend, not Arthur as abstract standard of excellence, but Arthur as a practical problem solver faced with a genuinely difficult challenge, and the way he solved it is more interesting than any duel he ever fought. The Kingswood Brotherhood emerged during the middle years of Aerys II's reign, roughly 20 years before the main events of Game of Thrones. The Kingswood itself is a large and dense forest southeast of King's Landing, the kind of terrain that has historically favored guerrilla tactics and made conventional military pursuit enormously difficult. The Brotherhood, under the leadership of a man named Simon Toyne, himself from a noble house of the Stormlands that had fallen into disgrace, had established itself as a genuinely dangerous presence in this forest. They kidnapped nobles for ransom. They attacked travelers. They were bold enough and organized enough that they had managed to attack the escort of Princess Elia Martell herself at one point, injuring the Lord Commander Gerald Hightower in the process. That last act, in particular, had earned them the full and furious attention of the crown. King Aerys sent the Kingsguard to deal with the problem. With Hightower injured, Arthur Dayne effectively led the operation in the field. Now, the standard approach to a problem like the Kingswood Brotherhood would have been simple and brutal. Drive military force into the forest, hunt down the outlaws, kill them, and display the bodies as a warning. This approach had been tried before Arthur arrived, to inadequate results. The reason it had failed brings us to the most interesting aspect of this whole episode. The small folk of the Kingswood were actively protecting the Brotherhood, sheltering them, providing them with intelligence about the movements of crown forces, refusing to cooperate with the soldiers sent to hunt the outlaws down, not because they were coerced into it, but because they genuinely wanted to. Why would ordinary farmers and forest people protect a band of violent criminals from the crown's justice? The answer requires understanding a little of how life worked for common people in the Westerosi system. When royal or noble forces moved through an area, they typically helped themselves to whatever they needed: food, shelter, horses, labor, with little or no compensation. This was simply how it worked. The small folk had no legal recourse, no political voice, no mechanism for protecting their interests against the depredations of armed men who technically had the king's authority behind them. They were, in practice, as vulnerable to the crown's forces as to any outlaw band. In some ways more so, because the outlaws at least had to maintain some local goodwill to survive. The Brotherhood, whatever their crimes, had apparently figured this out and played to it. They had made themselves into something the small folk could support, defenders of common people's rights, standing against the noble system that ignored and exploited those people. This was probably partly cynical and partly genuine, in the way a lot of outlaw mythology works, but the effect was real. As long as the people of the Kingswood believed the Brotherhood was in some sense on their side, you could not get the information needed to find and eliminate the outlaws. Arthur Dayne looked at this situation and understood immediately what had to change. You could not solve a political problem with military force alone. The small folk were protecting the Brotherhood because the Brotherhood served interests that nobody else was serving. The solution was not to terrorize the small folk into cooperation. That would simply deepen the resentment and make the problem worse. The solution was to address the actual grievances. So, Arthur paid for everything. Every piece of food his forces consumed, every night of shelter, every horse borrowed. He compensated the people fairly and transparently. And beyond that, he took the genuine political concerns of the small folk directly to King Aerys and petitioned the king to recognize and address their rights. Arthur was not just a soldier following orders here. He was functioning as a political actor, using his prestige in the king's ear to try to fix something that was broken in how the crown related to its own people. The results were swift and decisive. Once the small folk understood that the knights had arrived this time with something genuinely different, With respect rather than extraction, with listening rather than demanding, their calculation changed. The Brotherhood lost its shelter, lost its eyes and ears throughout the forest, stopped being able to disappear effectively because the network of hidden support was evaporating. And then the Kingsguard could do what it did well, which was fight. In the engagements that followed, several things happened that became legendary. Sir Barristan Selmy killed Simon Toyne, the leader of the Brotherhood, in direct combat, one of the many extraordinary individual acts in Barristan's long career. Jaime Lannister, then a 15 or 16-year-old squire with Lord Sumner Crakehall, encountered the Smiling Knight in individual combat and managed to hold his own, a feat worth noting because of the caliber of who the Smiling Knight was. The Smiling Knight. Even the name carries menace. We do not know his real name. The historical record did not find it worth preserving, which tells you something about how completely his identity was consumed by the character he had become. He was known by the expression that supposedly never left his face regardless of circumstances. The smile of a man for whom violence was not a duty or a necessity, but a genuine pleasure. Jaime Lannister, who had fought many dangerous people in his life, described him as the mountain of his boyhood, half the size of Gregor Clegane, but twice as dangerous in the particular way that madness makes people dangerous. Cruelty and chivalry all jumbled up together, was Jaime's phrase, which is a remarkable thing to say about someone. It means the Smiling Knight did not fit cleanly into the category of crude, violent thug or organized criminal. There was something more complex happening in him, some mixture of genuine martial skill and absolute disregard for conventional morality, wrapped in a personality that made him unpredictable and therefore much harder to fight against. He had already killed Sir Victor Tyrell, a member of one of the great noble houses, before Arthur Dayne's campaign against the Brotherhood. He was not a petty criminal. He was a genuine predator operating at a high level, and he was the Brotherhood member who posed the greatest individual threat. The duel between Arthur Dayne and the Smiling Knight is one of the canonical great duels of Westerosi history, and it unfolded in a way that reveals Arthur's character with almost surgical precision. They fought. It was not brief or one-sided in the expected way. The Smiling Knight was everything his reputation suggested, terrifyingly quick, completely unafraid, dangerous in that specific way that people who genuinely enjoy what they're doing are often dangerous, because they don't carry the hesitation and second-guessing that burdens people for whom violence is a reluctant necessity. He pushed Arthur. He forced the Sword of the Morning to actually work at this, which may have been one of the small number of times in Arthur's career where that was true, but the direction of things was never really in doubt. By the point at which the Smiling Knight had accumulated enough wounds to be seriously compromised, bleeding from something like a dozen separate cuts, according to the account, his sword was also in poor condition. The weapon had been notched and damaged through the course of the extended exchange. It was no longer reliable. Arthur stopped, right there. In the middle of what any other man would have treated as a clearly winning situation, opponent bleeding, opponent armed with a damaged weapon, opponent facing someone who had just demonstrated comprehensively superior skill, Arthur Dayne stopped and allowed the Smiling Knight to take a fresh sword from the weapons of the fallen on the ground nearby. He extended courtesy to a murderer. He allowed a criminal who had killed at least one nobleman and terrorized the population of the Kingswood for years the dignity of being able to pick up a blade that worked properly before Arthur finished what he had started. Why? There is no law that required this. There is no rule of honorable combat that explicitly demanded it in this particular situation. This was a battlefield engagement against an outlaw, not a formal tournament duel. Arthur could have ended it right then, at an advantage, and no one would have criticized him for it. What he was expressing in this act was a personal standard, a belief about what he was doing when he fought someone, a conviction that the fight had to be conducted in a certain way regardless of whether that way served his interests. The Smiling Knight took the fresh sword, and then he did the one thing in this whole exchange that you could call a touch of genuine wit. He looked at the pale blade in Arthur's hand and told him that the sword he actually wanted was Dawn, that white sword. Right there. Arthur's response has become one of the most quoted lines in Game of Thrones lore. 5 words. Then you shall have it, sir. The sir at the end. That is the detail that kills you. An outlaw, a murderer, a man who had been grinning while trying to kill him for the past several minutes. And Arthur Dayne extended the honorific of a knight. because the man had picked up a sword and fought with something resembling bravery, even in the service of chaos and crime. The smallest possible acknowledgement of what might have been, in a different world, under different circumstances. And then dawn moved, and the smiling knight was dead, and he had his answer. Following the defeat of the Brotherhood, Arthur Dayne stood before the young squire, who had held his own against the smiling knight for at least a few passes. He lifted Dawn. He touched the pale blade to the young man's shoulders. Jaime Lannister, 15 or 16 years old, kneeling before the finest knight in the Seven Kingdoms, was made a knight by the sword that was made from a fallen star. Years later, long after Arthur was dead, and Jaime had become something complicated and broken and occasionally magnificent in ways Arthur might not have recognized, he remembered that moment. He described Arthur as the finest knight he ever knew. Not his teachers, not his peers in the white cloak. Arthur Dayne, who had knighted him with Dawn in a forest, who had shown him in a single campaign what a knight was supposed to be, a fighter who combined excellence and intelligence and genuine moral consideration for ordinary people into something that made you understand why the whole elaborate institution of knighthood had been invented in the first place. Section 6, A Friendship Forged in Light and Shadow. Arthur and Rhaegar Targaryen. Of all the relationships that shaped Arthur Dayne's life, the one that carried the most weight and ultimately determined the manner of his death was his friendship with Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. The word friendship feels almost inadequate for what the sources describe between them. They are consistently called closest friends, not merely allies or colleagues or mutual admirers, but the oldest and most intimate of companions, the kind of relationship where you know someone so deeply and have known them so long that the bond has its own gravity, its own rules, its own obligations that exist outside whatever external arrangements the world might impose. Rhaegar Targaryen comes to us as one of the most intriguing figures in the entire Game of Thrones universe, in part because he is always absent. He died before the main story begins, killed by Robert Baratheon at the Battle of the Trident, and everything we know about him comes filtered through other people's memories. Memories colored by grief, by love, by hatred, by the distorting power of retrospect and mythology. He is never a man in the narrative. He is always already a ghost. This means that what we know about him is not objective observation, but something stranger and more interesting, the crystallized impression he left in the minds of the people who loved him most. Those impressions are remarkably consistent. Rhaegar was a person of unusual depth. He read obsessively as a child, to the point where it became something of a public joke at court, the bookish prince who seemed more interested in scrolls than swords. He was, by all accounts, genuinely melancholy. Not performatively sad in the way of the romantic tradition, but genuinely burdened by something, a weight that his contemporaries connected to the tragedy of Summer Hall, the great catastrophe that had destroyed much of his family and occurred on the day of his birth. He was born in grief, as one description puts it, and he carried that grief as part of his character for his entire life. What makes Rhaegar so fascinating is that this melancholy and this intellectual intensity were paired with something else, a determination, once he decided action was required, to be extraordinary at it. At some point in his youth, he read something in the old texts that convinced him he needed to be a warrior, that the time was coming when the prince who was promised would need to fight, and that the role demanded martial excellence. And so, he picked up a sword and became a tournament fighter of the highest order. Not someone who had grown up loving violence and competition, but someone who understood why excellence was required of him, and achieved it through sheer disciplined effort. He also played the harp, and by all accounts, he played it with a quality that went beyond technical skill into something more unnerving, the kind of playing that made women cry who weren't expecting to cry, that made even battle-hardened knights feel something they didn't quite have words for. He took whatever he turned his attention to seriously, and when he turned his attention to music or swordsmanship or the study of prophecy, the result was always extraordinary. The friendship between Rhaegar and Arthur seems to have developed through the natural proximity of Kingsguard service and tournament competition. A Kingsguard knight lived alongside the royal family, shared their world, was present for the private moments as well as the public ones. Arthur would have known Rhaegar not just as the crown prince in his formal aspect, but as the man who sat by himself with his harp and played songs that made everyone feel something, who stayed up late studying old texts and woke with new questions about ancient prophecies, who was thoughtful and sad, and occasionally lit up from within when a genuinely interesting problem presented itself. Their tournament record against each other shows the depth of the relationship. In 276 AC, at a great tournament held at Lannisport to honor the birth of Prince Viserys Targaryen, Arthur Dayne won the tournament, defeating Rhaegar himself in the competition. This was the first and perhaps only occasion on which Arthur clearly bested Rhaegar in the lists. In a subsequent tournament, the exchange was more even. Arthur broke 12 lances against Rhaegar before losing to the prince. 12 lances. In tournament jousting at this level, that number represents an extended and exhausting engagement between two people operating at very close to the absolute ceiling of the activity. And then at the great tourney at Harrenhal in 281 AC, Rhaegar defeated Arthur again. What you see in this record is not a simple hierarchy of better and worse. You see two great fighters who pushed each other to their limits over years of competition, who knew each other's capabilities more intimately than almost any outside observer possibly could. When you have contested with someone at that level, when you have felt the weight of their particular strengths, have learned to read their specific patterns, have experienced firsthand the places where they exceed you and the places where you exceed them, you know that person in a way that no amount of ordinary social acquaintance can replicate. The knowledge is physical as well as intellectual. It lives in your body as well as your mind. Rhaegar trusted Arthur Dayne with things he did not trust to many people. This comes through consistently in the fragmentary accounts. The prince who was more comfortable with his books and his harp than with most of his courtiers had a small inner circle of genuine confidants. John Connington for a time, Richard Lonmouth and Miles Mouton, his squires who became his knights and stayed close after. But Arthur Dayne was the oldest friend, the one who had known him longest and most deeply, the one who was present for the whole arc. When the crucial moment came, when Rhaegar needed someone he absolutely trusted to do the most important thing in his world, he sent Arthur. The great tourney at Harrenhal in 281 AC was a pivot point in the history of the realm in ways that not everyone present understood at the time. It was the largest and most prestigious tournament in recent memory, attended by lords and knights from across the Seven Kingdoms. It was also, under its social surface, something else, a gathering that Rhaegar may have engineered partly as a venue for meeting with lords he needed to speak to about the problem of his father, the Mad King, whose deterioration had by this point become a genuine crisis for the realm. The Wents, who hosted the tournament, had significant connections to Rhaegar's inner circle, and Oswell Went, who became one of the 3 Kingsguard at the Tower of Joy, was part of the Brotherhood whose loyalty had shifted from Aerys to Rhaegar. Arthur, according to the semi-canonical accounts, assisted Rhaegar in what happened immediately after the tournament, the business with Lyanna Stark that set the entire realm on fire. Whether Lyanna was taken by force, whether she went willingly, whether she and Rhaegar had been in love from before the tournament, or whether the events of Harrenhal produced something unexpected. The truth of this is still contested by the characters within the story, and deliberately left somewhat ambiguous by Martin. What is clear is that Arthur was involved. He was one of the most trusted people in Rhaegar's world. Whatever happened, he was part of it. And then Arthur stood at the Tower of Joy and paid the final price of that trust. Section 7. Robert's Rebellion and the Weight of Orders. Why the greatest knight sat out the greatest war. Robert's Rebellion is the foundational catastrophe of the Game of Thrones narrative. It is the event that ended 300 years of Targaryen rule, killed the dynasty's heir at the Battle of the Trident, brought down the Mad King through betrayal from within his own Kingsguard, and installed Robert Baratheon on a throne he was never quite adequate to occupy. Everything in the main story of Game of Thrones, the politics of King's Landing, the grudges between houses, the exile of Daenerys and Viserys, the identity of Jon Snow, flows from the decisions and deaths of Robert's Rebellion. It is the original sin of the world we inhabit when we watch the show, and Sir Arthur Dayne, the finest knight of his generation, the most dangerous individual warrior in the Seven Kingdoms, was not there. He was in Dorne. This is genuinely difficult to sit with. Robert's Rebellion was decided at the Battle of the Trident, where Robert Baratheon and Rhaegar Targaryen met in single combat, in the middle of a river, while 2 armies tried to kill each other around them. Robert won. Rhaegar died with Robert's warhammer in his chest, his rubies scattering across the current. And the rebellion, having been essentially decapitated of its legitimacy and its most charismatic figure, lost its momentum and collapsed over the following weeks. King's Landing fell. Aerys died. The Targaryens lost their throne. If Arthur Dayne had been at the Trident, the battle would have been different. Oswell Whent said as much at the Tower of Joy. With characteristic bluntness, he told Ned that Robert would be beneath the ground if they had been there. This is almost certainly true. Arthur Dayne against Robert Baratheon is not a balanced fight. Robert was an extraordinary warrior in his own right, a physically massive man with the kind of brutal, aggressive, hammer and thunder fighting style that won battles by overwhelming opponents before they could think clearly. He was brave past the point of recklessness and possessed of the frightening momentum of a man who had never been seriously beaten. But he was not Arthur Dayne. Very few people were Arthur Dayne, and in single combat with a man of Arthur's particular skill, operating with Dawn in hand, the historical record strongly suggests that Robert would have died in that river. The rebellion would have ended differently. Rhaegar might have survived. The Targaryen dynasty might have continued, with Rhaegar eventually taking the throne from his increasingly unhinged father and implementing whatever reforms and changes he had been planning. The whole tragic sequence of events, Cersei's children, the War of the Five Kings, the Long Night, everything might have been shaped completely differently. Arthur Dayne chose not to be there. He followed Rhaegar's orders. He stayed in Dorne. This is the decision that defines his legacy in the most complicated way, and it deserves careful thought. Rhaegar sent his three most loyal Kingsguard, Arthur, Gerald Hightower, and Oswell Whent, to the Tower of Joy to protect Lyanna Stark during her pregnancy. This was, from Rhaegar's perspective, the protection of something more precious than his own victory in battle. He believed, with the fervor of a man who had spent his life reading prophecy and making meaning from it, that the child Lyanna carried was of cosmological significance, the prince who was promised, the fire and ice made flesh, the person around whom the fate of the world might turn when the darkness came again. Rhaegar went to fight Robert on the Trident because he had to, because the rebellion required it, because someone had to stand at the center of the war and hold the Targaryen side together. But he sent his greatest knight to guard what he loved most and what he believed mattered most. The Kingsguard at the Tower of Joy were technically violating their oath to Aerys by following Rhaegar's orders rather than returning to defend the king in his capital. Their formal obligation was to the sitting king, and the king needed defending. But they had already made their choice. Their loyalty had transferred, as it had for many people in the court, from the broken and monstrous Aerys to the prince who should have been king. They were serving Rhaegar's agenda, even while wearing the sigil of the Kingsguard, and everyone involved knew it. When the war was lost, when Rhaegar died on the Trident, when King's Landing fell, when Aerys was killed by Jaime Lannister, when Robert Baratheon sat on the Iron Throne, and the dynasty was finished, 3 Kingsguard in white cloaks stood at a small tower in the Red Mountains of Dorne and did not move. Why? Rhaegar was dead. His cause had failed. The obligation they had followed into Dorne was, in the narrow political sense, ended. They could have walked away. They could have surrendered. They could have disappeared into Essos and made new lives, as many Targaryen loyalists did. They stayed, because there was something in the tower, something that Rhaegar had died for, something that now depended, more completely than it ever had before, on the 3 men who had been left to guard it. Lyanna Stark was inside the tower, dying. She had given birth to a child, a boy, dark-haired, already screaming with all the fury of a new life. And this child was the most dangerous thing in the realm at that moment. Not dangerous in the sense of power, he was an infant. Dangerous in the sense that Robert Baratheon, sitting now on the Iron Throne, would have him killed the moment he learned of his existence. Robert's hatred of Rhaegar had not ended with Rhaegar's death. It extended to everything Rhaegar had produced. He had already agreed to the deaths of Rhaegar's other children, the infant Aegon and the young Rhaenys, murdered by Gregor Clegane during the sack. He would have agreed to the death of this one too, had he known. Arthur Dayne stood at that door knowing all of this, knowing the war was lost, knowing his master was dead, knowing that the child in the tower was the reason all of this had happened, was the reason Lyanna was dying, was the reason a rebellion had consumed the realm and killed tens of thousands of people. Standing in his white cloak, with his pale sword, at the end of everything, keeping a promise to a dead man, because that was what he had sworn to do. And when Ned Stark arrived with 6 companions, Arthur Dayne fought. Not because he hoped to win, not because he thought fighting was rational or even truly defensible, but because his prince had asked him to be there, and he was there, And the door behind him held something that mattered, and he would not yield it until there was no more yielding to be done. Section 8. The Tower of Joy. The last stand of the Sword of the Morning. The Tower of Joy was small. This is one of the details that matters more than it might seem, because in the imagination, we tend to make the locations of legendary events large. We picture towers that pierce the sky and battlements stretching across horizons. But the actual Tower of Joy was a modest, round structure, located at the northern end of the Prince's Pass through the Red Mountains of Dorne. A shepherd's tower, or a watchtower of no particular strategic importance, notable only for being in a sufficiently private location that a dying woman and a dangerous secret could be kept there without too many eyes finding them. Rhaegar had given it its name. A small, impractical, deeply human gesture, naming a forgotten tower in a mountain pass, the Tower of Joy, because of what had happened there, because the time he had spent with Lyanna in that place had meant something to him. For Ned Stark, riding south with 6 companions after helping lift the siege of Storm's End, it was anything but joyful. It was the destination of one of the most personally agonizing journeys of his life. His sister was in that tower. His sister Lyanna, who had apparently gone willingly or been taken forcibly by the Crown Prince, who had been the spark that set the continent ablaze, who had been the face on the war that had cost Ned his father and brother and his best friend and thousands of men who had followed him south. He was going to get her. He was going to bring her home. He had every reason to expect this part of the journey to be relief, to be the resolution of something terrible. 3 men in white cloaks were standing in the way. The 7 Northerners who approached the tower that day were no ordinary fighters. Howland Reed, the Crannog man, was not personally known as a great warrior. His people fought with nets and poison and the guerrilla tactics of the swamp, not with heavy steel in open combat. But the others, Lord Willem Dustin, Ethan Glover, Martin Castle, Theo Wool, Sir Mark Ryswell, these were Northern warriors who had survived the entire course of Robert's rebellion. They had been through the bloodiest fighting in the 7 kingdoms. They were hardened, experienced, alive when so many others were not. Against 3 Kingsguard who had not fought in the war at all, who had been resting in Dorne while the battle raged, waiting. 3 Kingsguard who had been there with their full strength intact, with their skills undiminished, facing 7 opponents who were tired from months of campaigning. The exchange before the fighting began carries the weight of tragedy already compressed into a few lines of dialogue. Ned, telling them he had looked for them at the Trident. The Kingsguard, explaining that they hadn't been there. Oswell Wynt, noting bluntly that Robert would be dead if they had been. And then Ned pressing further, "The Mad King is dead, Rhaegar lies beneath the ground. Why aren't you standing aside? Why is any of this still happening?" Arthur's answer, "Our prince wanted us here," is not quite defiance. It is simpler than defiance, which always carries a note of bitterness or resistance. It is loyalty distilled to its most pure and most terrible form. Our prince wanted us here. That is the entirety of the explanation. The world has ended around us. The dynasty has fallen. The king is dead. Our reasons are gone. And still we are here because here is where we were told to be, and we do not leave where we were told to be. Then Arthur said something else. He wished Ned good fortune in the wars to come. This line has been discussed endlessly, and for good reason, because it is such an odd thing to say to someone you are about to try to kill. It sounds like something you say to someone you expect to survive the encounter, someone you are not intending to kill. It sounds, if you want it to follow the most interesting interpretation of events, like something a man says when he knows the person in front of him is going to walk away from this, when he is perhaps not trying as hard as he could to prevent that outcome, while still honoring the oath that requires him to stand at the door. Whether Arthur was fighting to kill Ned or fighting to reduce the number of witnesses to what was inside the tower while ensuring that Ned alone survived, that is the great unanswered question of this scene. The evidence is ambiguous by design. What is not ambiguous is what happened in the fight itself. Arthur Dayne moved through the 7 Northerners with an efficiency that the 3-eyed raven described when Bran witnessed the vision, not as superiority or advantage, but as being of an entirely different category. Bran observed that Arthur was better than his father. Brynden Rivers, the 3-eyed raven, corrected him immediately. Not better, far better. The distinction matters. Better suggests a gap that skill or effort or determination might close. Far better suggests a difference in kind, not degree. a distance that could not be crossed regardless of how hard you tried or how good you were within the limits of what you were. The men who had survived an entire war fell. Willem Dustin, whose widow Lady Barbary would resent Ned for decades for returning her husband's horse but not his bones. Martin Castle, father of Jory Castle, who would later serve in Ned's household guard. Theo Wool, Ethan Glover, Sir Mark Risewell. One by one, Arthur Dayne ended them. The pale sword moved in ways that were difficult to follow. The two swords in the television adaptation, Dawn and a Second Blade, cut the air with a grace that turns something violent into something almost beautiful, the kind of fighting that makes you understand why this specific combination of speed and skill and precision, when it appears in a human being, tends to produce mythology. Howland Reed took a wound and went down, or appeared to. His people, the Crannogmen of the Neck, are known for fighting in ways that look different from conventional Westerosi combat: nets, poison, patience, the willingness to use tactics that proud knights disdain. Howland was not a conventional fighter, and perhaps he knew better than to try to be one. He went down, and Arthur believed the threat from him was over. And then it was Ned alone, and Arthur, and the gap between them was vast. Arthur disarmed him. Ned's sword was gone. The sword of the morning stood over the Lord of Winterfell with the pale blade of dawn in hand, and the end of the story was clear. There was nothing left. There was only the ending. Howland Reed stood up. He drove something into the back of Arthur Dayne's neck. A mortal wound, sudden and completely without warning, from a direction and from a source that Arthur had already assessed as neutralized. The greatest knight in the Seven Kingdoms fell to his knees. His hand kept its grip on Dawn for a few seconds, that pale blade still holding light, even as the man who held it had nothing left to hold on with. And then the sword fell, and Arthur knelt in the dust of Dorne, and he accepted what had come. Ned picked up Dawn. He looked at Arthur. Some exchange happened in that moment. Not words necessarily, but something. Recognition, respect. The acknowledgement of something that could not be spoken aloud, but was real. And then Ned ended it. The mercy blow. Ending a death that would otherwise be slow and ugly. And Sir Arthur Dayne was gone. Inside the tower, Lyanna was dying. She had given birth, and it had been too much, and she was bleeding in ways that could not be stopped. And she had a son, a dark-haired boy who screamed with the indignant fury of new life, oblivious to the blood and the death and the war that had been fought all around him. Lyanna made Ned promise. Keep him safe. Robert cannot know. Promise me. He promised, and he took the boy north, and he carried the secret for 17 years and never broke it, not once, not even when it would have saved him. Because he had made a promise, and he was the kind of man who kept promises, even when the cost of keeping them was everything. After the fight, Ned had the tower stones used to build cairns for the 8 dead, his companions, and the 3 Kingsguard. He buried them there, in Dorne, as best he could, and then he rode to Starfall, with Dawn in his hands, and returned it to Ashara Dayne. Because that was the right thing to do, and Ned Stark did the right thing even when no one required it of him. Ashara Dayne threw herself from the highest tower of Starfall sometime after that visit, into the sea below the coastal cliffs. Her body was never found. The specific reasons for her death have never been definitively established. Some sources suggest it was grief over a stillborn child of her own. Some suggest it was the grief of losing her brother, the person closest to her in the world. Some suggest that Ned's role in Arthur's death, that the man she may have loved had killed the brother she had adored, was more than she could hold. All of these things may have been true simultaneously, the way grief rarely has clean singular causes. What is certain is that the death at the Tower of Joy sent out concentric rings of tragedy that kept expanding long after the battle was over. It killed the 3 Kingsguard. It killed Lyanna Stark. It killed, indirectly, Ashara Dayne. And it deposited a secret into the world that would reshape everything 17 years later, when a boy named Jon Snow finally learned who his parents were. Section 9. The Legacy. What the Sword of the Morning left behind. In the aftermath of Robert's rebellion, as the dust settled and the new order established itself across the 7 kingdoms, the memory of Arthur Dayne did something unusual in the world of Game of Thrones. It did not fade the way most memories fade. It did not diminish with the passage of years or the accumulation of new heroes and new stories. It grew, and it deepened. and it became one of those reference points against which everything else was measured. Jaime Lannister's relationship to Arthur's memory is perhaps the most psychologically revealing in the entire story. Jaime was 15 when he fought beside Arthur in the Kingswood. He was 15 when Arthur knighted him with Dawn on the battlefield. And from that moment, the image of Arthur Dayne, not just the fighter, but the person, the complete embodiment of what a knight was supposed to be, became the standard against which Jaime measured himself for the rest of his life. This is important to understand about Jaime, because Jaime is one of the most morally complex figures in Game of Thrones, precisely because of the gap between his aspiration and his reality. He started his Kingsguard career wanting to be Arthur Dayne. He wanted to fight with that grace, to conduct himself with that honor, to be the knight that people described in hushed, reverent tones decades after you were dead. He had the skills for it, or something close to them. But the circumstances of his service, the specific moral horror of standing next to the Mad King as Aerys burned innocent people alive, confronted him with a choice that Arthur's generation had apparently found a way to avoid or defer. Jaime could not defer it. He made his choice, and that choice made him the Kingslayer, and the Kingslayer is not what he had wanted to be at 15. In one of the most searching moments of his internal monologue in the books, Jaime asks himself when that 15-year-old boy died. When did the version of himself that wanted to be Sir Arthur Dayne disappear? He doesn't know the answer. He acknowledges that somewhere along the way he had become the Smiling Knight instead. The other fighter from that Kingswood campaign, the one who embodied cruelty and chivalry, jumbled together rather than properly aligned. The Smiling Knight was not a villain without any redeeming quality. He was a brilliant fighter with a broken moral compass. Jaime saw himself in that description, saw the ways his life had produced a similar disjunction, and was not comfortable with what he saw. But the aspiration, the image of Arthur Dayne, never left him. When Jaime, as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard in the post-rebellion era, confronted the members of his Brotherhood about their inadequacy, he invoked Arthur as the standard they were failing to meet, not as historical trivia, as a living rebuke. This is what a Kingsguard member was supposed to be. This is the gap between what we are and what we should be. Arthur Dayne is the measurement. The effect of this is that Arthur's standard, delivered through Jaime's reverence, effectively shaped the entire Kingsguard institution for decades after his death. Every discussion of what the White Cloak was supposed to mean, every attempt to articulate the ideal that the Brotherhood was supposed to represent, ran through the reference point of the Sword of the Morning. The institution that had to some extent failed him, that had been unable to prevent the Mad King's atrocities, that had dissolved in dishonor with the sack of King's Landing, nonetheless preserved his memory as the image of what it should have been. Barristan Selmy's view of Arthur Dayne adds another layer. Barristan is in a unique position as a witness. He served alongside Arthur, knew him as a peer and colleague, competed beside him, and presumably against him in various contexts. His assessments carry the authority of direct personal knowledge rather than second-hand reputation, and Barristan consistently placed Arthur at the very top, not quite above himself in all respects. Barristan was too measured and self-aware to make a crude ranking, but at the same elevation, perhaps a fraction higher. Someone who operated at the ceiling of what was possible, whose specific advantages, the sword, the physical strength, the something extra that people who watched him described and struggled to name, placed him beyond any direct comparison. Barristan also connects Arthur to the broader theme of what went wrong with Aerys's Kingsguard and with the institution as a whole. He shared the guilt of that generation, the guilt of having stood by as the Mad King burned people alive, of having been technically bound by an oath to protect a king who deserved no protection. He knew Arthur would have shared that guilt too, in whatever private moments Arthur allowed himself such reflection. The Kingsguard of that era were not villains. They were men of genuine quality, trapped in a system that made genuine quality irrelevant, because the system's demands did not correlate with the demands of genuine moral action. Among the Daynes themselves, Arthur's memory took on the character of both pride and burden. Pride because he had been extraordinary, had taken the family's most prestigious title and filled it more completely than anyone in living memory. Burden because nothing that came after him could quite measure up, and the sword that was supposed to pass from worthy hands to worthy hands had stayed in its tower since his death, waiting for a successor who had not yet appeared. His nephew, young Lord Edric Dayne, carried the weight of this particularly directly, named Ned as a nickname, which carries its own complicated resonance, given that Ned Stark was the man who killed his uncle. This young lord lived in the shadow of a legend he had never known but could not escape. In the broader culture of Westeros, Arthur had become a reference point for greatness that transcended his immediate context. When people wanted to describe an extraordinary fighter, they compared them to Barristan or Arthur. When people wanted to articulate what the ideal knight was supposed to be, skilled and honorable and genuinely concerned with others, the name that came up was the Sword of the Morning. He was, in death, exactly what he had been in life, with the added dimension that death always gives the remarkable. He was frozen at his peak, immune to the diminishments of age and time, forever the thing he was when he was at his best. Section 10. The Greatest Debate. Was Arthur Dayne truly the best? Now we settle something. Now we actually do the work that the lore demands and assess Sir Arthur Dayne's place in the hierarchy of the greatest fighters in the history of Westeros. This is the argument that has been had in every Game of Thrones fan community since the franchise began, and it deserves a thorough and honest engagement. Let us start with the clearest evidence we have, which is George R.R. Martin's own statements. Martin does not speak lightly about his character's capabilities, and when he has addressed the question of Arthur Dayne's skill directly, he has been specific and revealing. Asked about the matchup between Arthur Dayne and Barristan Selmy, perhaps the two fighters most naturally compared as the greatest of their era, Martin said this: "With equivalent weapons, it would be an even fight. Too close to call. A genuine contest between two men at the absolute ceiling of human martial achievement. But if Arthur had Dawn, he would win. The sword's superiority in material quality would tip the balance that was otherwise perfectly even." Martin also said, in a separate context, that he would choose Arthur Dayne as his champion in a trial by combat. Given access to any fighter who ever lived in his world, he would take Arthur. Not Barristan, despite Barristan's extraordinary documented record. Not Jaime at his absolute peak. Arthur Dayne. This is not a casual statement. This is the author, who knows every character's capabilities from the inside, making a definitive judgment. Barristan Selmy's accomplishments are genuinely formidable and deserve acknowledgement in any serious comparison. In the War of the Ninepenny Kings, he killed Maelys the Monstrous, the last of the Blackfyre pretenders, ending that particular dynastic conflict with a single act of individual combat. Maelys was not an ordinary man. He was physically enormous, reportedly strong enough that he had once killed his cousin by strangling him in single combat and carried the man's skull at his belt as a trophy. He represented the kind of physical threat that made experienced warriors careful. Barristan killed him. In the Battle of the Trident, Barristan fought in the center of some of the hardest combat of Robert's rebellion and survived, which is itself a remarkable feat. In his 60s, he was still cutting through some of the finest fighters in the free companies of Essos with an efficiency that bordered on the implausible. The man simply did not diminish in the expected ways. But Barristan himself, by the evidence of his own statements and behavior, placed Arthur above himself, or at the very least at precisely the same level. The way he described Arthur carried the quality of someone describing a peer he fully recognized as such, with the particular respect you reserve for someone who pushed you to your absolute limits. And his specific acknowledgement that the finest natural swordsman he had seen since Arthur was a later fighter in Essos, since Arthur doing a lot of work in that sentence, establishes Arthur as the benchmark even for Barristan's own assessments. Jaime Lannister at his peak is the other candidate that must be seriously engaged. The one-handed post-Harrenhal Jaime of the main story is a diminished fighter, genuinely limited in ways that he himself acknowledges with brutal honesty. But peak Jaime, the Jaime who had served in the Kingsguard through the years of Robert's reign, who had maintained and refined the extraordinary gifts he showed in his youth, who was described by Barristan Selmy as the finest natural swordsman Barristan had seen in a very long time. That Jaime is among the most dangerous fighters in Westerosi history. Jaime said that Arthur was stronger than he was, physically stronger, raw power advantage. Combined with technical superiority, this creates a compounding disadvantage that is very difficult to overcome. Jaime also, in a moment of unusual directness, told a woman at Derry, who referenced the Smiling Knight's death, that the Sword of the Morning killed the Smiling Knight. Sir Arthur Dayne, a better knight than me. This is Jaime Lannister, the man who was probably at that point the second or third most dangerous fighter in the realm, looking back and naming someone better, without hedging, without qualification, just better. The broader historical comparison is more contested and more interesting, because it requires placing Arthur against figures from earlier eras whose full capabilities we can only guess at through reputation and story. Aemon the Dragon Knight, who served as Kingsguard to 3 Targaryen kings and who many scholars of the sword consider the greatest individual fighter in the recorded history of Westeros, creates the most interesting comparison point. Cregan Stark, the great Lord of Winterfell, who came south with his winter wolves at the end of the Dance of Dragons, and who Aemon himself said gave him the hardest fight of his life. Cregan operates at a level that suggests even Aemon's peak was not absolute. Daemon Blackfyre, whose swordsmanship was so extraordinary that the great swordsman Ulrich Dayne himself was considered his equal, but no one else was named in that category. What can be said honestly is that the question of whether Arthur is the greatest fighter in all of Westerosi history is genuinely debatable. Aemon the Dragon Knight has a legitimate claim. Daemon Blackfyre might. Cregan Stark at his peak might. These are comparisons across centuries and different martial traditions and different contexts, and making them definitively is impossible. Within his own era, there is no serious debate. Arthur Dayne was the greatest. The author says so. Every major fighter of his generation says so in their own ways. The three-eyed raven watching him fight said, "Far better," with a finality that admitted no further argument. And within the specific tradition of the Kingsguard, the institution whose purpose was to produce the finest fighters possible in service of the crown, Arthur stands as the peak achievement. The Kingsguard of his era is generally considered the finest generation the institution ever produced, a gathering of genuine excellence under one white cloak, and within that gathering, Arthur was the finest, the deadliest, as Catelyn Stark put it, with the word of someone who had no personal motive to elevate him. The sword of the morning, pale blade, milk glass, alive with light, the fallen star shaped into something that the world could only produce once. Section 11. The Paradox of Perfect Honor. What Arthur Dayne teaches us about greatness in a broken world. There is a darkness that runs beneath the brightness of Arthur Dayne's legend, and it would be dishonest, and actually less interesting, to explore this character without confronting it honestly. Because Arthur Dayne was not a simple hero. He was a man of extraordinary personal virtue who existed within and served institutions that committed genuine evil, and the relationship between his individual quality and his institutional context is one of the most morally complex things in Game of Thrones. King Aerys II Targaryen, the Mad King, was by any honest assessment a monster, not a complicated political figure whose crimes can be rationalized by the pressures of governance and the difficult calculus of power, a man who burned people alive for personal pleasure, a man whose paranoia had shattered every meaningful relationship in his life, and who had developed a specific sadistic pleasure in the public humiliation and torture of those who fell under his displeasure. He had burned the Lord of Winterfell and strangled his son with a noose in front of the assembled court. He had burned Rickard Stark in his armor, while Brandon Stark strangled himself trying to reach his father. He was, in the most unqualified way, evil. Arthur Dayne wore that man's white cloak. Arthur Dayne stood in those rooms. Arthur Dayne was present in the court of Aerys II and served the institution whose primary obligation was the protection of Aerys's body and the execution of Aerys's will. Barristan Selmy spent decades after Aerys's death regretting this. He was consumed by the knowledge that he had been present for atrocities he did not prevent, that his oath had been used as a mechanism to enable a monster, that the thing he had given his life to had been turned into something that served evil. He thought about this, wrestled with it, and found no clean resolution. There was none to find. Arthur Dayne died before he had to live with this knowledge the way Barristan lived with it. He was spared, in a sense, by his death at the Tower of Joy, from the decades of reflection that might have brought him to the same difficult place. But he was not innocent of the same institutional entanglement. He served Aerys. He stood in those halls. The one crucial difference between Arthur and the rest of the Kingsguard, the thing that slightly complicates any simple indictment, is that Arthur, along with Oswell Went and Gerald Hightower, had effectively transferred his loyalty to Rhaegar. He was not serving Aerys in any genuine sense. He was serving the hope of Rhaegar, the hope that the son would become king and heal what the father had broken. He wore the white cloak while essentially functioning as an agent of the alternative he believed was coming. This does not fully absolve him. He was still standing in those rooms, but it provides context that makes him less simply complicit. There is also the question of Lyanna Stark, which goes to another form of moral complexity. Whatever the truth of what happened between Rhaegar and Lyanna, whether it was abduction or elopement or some ambiguous middle ground that neither word quite captures, a young woman of 15 ended up isolated in a tower in the mountains of Dorne, pregnant, far from her family, during a war that was partly being fought over her. Arthur Dayne was part of the apparatus that kept her there. He was one of the three swords standing between Lyanna and the Outseed world. Whether she wanted to leave or wanted to stay, whether she was a prisoner or a willing participant, Arthur was the mechanism by which she was separated from her family and her home. These are not comfortable facts. They do not fit neatly into the legend of the most chivalrous warrior of the Seven Kingdoms. They are the places where the legend encounters the reality of what institutional loyalty looks like when the institution is serving something morally problematic. Arthur was capable of extraordinary chivalry, the pausing of the duel with the Smiling Knight, the championship of the small folks' rights, the knighting of Jaime Lannister in recognition of genuine valor. And he was also capable of standing at a door and refusing to let a young woman's brother through to find her. Jaime Lannister resolved this contradiction in the most dramatic way possible. He broke his oath and killed the king, accepted eternal shame for doing so, and spent the rest of his life living with the consequences of having done the right thing in the wrong way. Barristan Selmy resolved it the other way, by keeping his oath until the end, accepting the institutional obligation as absolute, and spending the rest of his life with the shame of what that obedience had enabled. Arthur Dayne died at the Tower of Joy without having fully resolved it, in the middle of the action rather than in the aftermath reflection. He was fighting for something, for the child in the tower, for Rhaegar's dream, for whatever promise he had made with his presence at that place. He was not fighting for Aerys. He was not fighting for the dynasty in its rotted form. He was fighting for the specific hope that had brought him to Dorne, armed with the most extraordinary sword in the world, wearing the white cloak of an institution he had honored more genuinely than most of his brothers. What Arthur Dayne teaches us in the final accounting is something about the limits of individual virtue in institutional contexts. He was as good as a person could be. His individual character was, by every account, genuinely exceptional, not just skillful but principled, not just brave but wise, not just powerful but careful with that power. And he still ended up tangled in the structures of his world in ways that required him to do things that are difficult to fully defend. Not because he was weak or hypocritical, but because genuinely excellent people, embedded in broken institutions, cannot escape the compromises those institutions demand. They can minimize them. They can shape them. They cannot avoid them entirely. This is one of the reasons Arthur Dayne's story endures, not because it is a simple story of heroism, but because it is a complicated story about what happens when genuine greatness meets genuine complexity. When the finest knight who ever lived serves a mad king. When the most chivalrous warrior of his generation helps isolate a young woman in a mountain tower. When the man whose death Ned Stark most honored died because the cause he was serving, however pure in its intentions, produced chaos and suffering that could not be controlled. George R.R. Martin's great theme, the one that runs through every volume of Ice and Fire and every episode of Game of Thrones, is that the world does not sort itself neatly into heroes and villains, that good people do terrible things and terrible people do things of real beauty and courage, and that virtue is not a shield against the complexity of the world, but a quality that engages with that complexity without surrendering to it. Arthur Dayne is perhaps the purest expression of this theme in the whole cast. He was everything that the best people are supposed to be, and he died serving a cause whose costs were paid by people who had not chosen them. He was magnificent and he was limited, and the combination of those two things is what makes him still worth talking about, still worth sitting with in the quiet, still worth following all the way from a falling star at the mouth of a river to a forgotten tower in the Red Mountains of Dorne, where the world ended and began at the same time. The pale sword went back to Starfall. It sits there still, waiting, the sword of the morning, the finest knight who ever lived. and no one since has been worthy of his name. Closing. The light that stays, we have traveled a long way tonight, from the dawn of recorded Westerosi history to the dusty clearing of a forgotten mountain pass, from the mythic origins of a house whose founder followed a falling star to the very human tragedy of a man who followed us in order to his death. We have tried to understand not just what Arthur Dayne was, the legendary fighter, the pale sword, the standard against which everything else is measured, but who he was, the second son of a Dornish lord, the friend of a prince who dreamed too large, the knight who stopped a duel to give a murderer a fair weapon, the man who stood at a door in Dorne and refused to move even when the world had collapsed around him, because he had been told to stand there, and standing there was the last thing he could do for a man he had loved. The reason Arthur Dayne endures as a figure, beyond the obvious fact of his extraordinary skill, beyond the mythology of Dawn and the title of Sword of the Morning, is that he represents a particular kind of greatness that this world both celebrates and destroys, the kind that refuses compromise on questions of character, the kind that extends courtesy to enemies, that thinks about the rights of common people, that uses overwhelming power carefully rather than casually, the kind that, when it appears in a person, makes everyone around them quietly reconsider their own standards. Ned Stark fought Arthur Dayne and survived only because of what amounted to an ambush. And Ned spent the rest of his life calling Arthur the finest knight he ever saw. Not with bitterness, not with defensiveness, with the simple, sorrowful honesty of a man who saw something rare and beautiful and watched it end and knew it for what it was. In a story full of cynicism about power and institutions and the gap between what people claim to be and what they actually are, Arthur Dayne is the closest thing to the ideal that the world produces. Not a perfect ideal. We have been honest about the complications, but the closest, the best argument the world of Game of Thrones ever makes for what human excellence looks like when it is allowed to fully realize itself. Dawn sits in the White Sword Tower at Starfall, pale as milk glass, holding whatever light it can find, waiting for someone worthy. The swords of the morning are all famous throughout the Seven Kingdoms. There are boys who secretly dream of being a son of Starfall, so they might claim that storied sword in its title. Most famous of all was Sir Arthur Dayne, most famous of all, and after his death, the sword waited, and is waiting still. If this journey through the life and legend of Sir Arthur Dayne is the kind of thing that kept you company tonight, if the quiet, the depth, the careful attention to this world and what it means found you in the right mood, then please leave a like on this video. It is a small thing, and it helps more than you might think. Subscribe if you want to continue this kind of exploration. There are more figures like Arthur Dayne waiting in the lore of this world, people whose stories shape everything that came after, whose legacies echo forward through the entire narrative, whose lives deserve the kind of unhurried, careful attention that we gave this one tonight. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your time, wherever in the world you gave it from, and whatever time it was when you pressed play. May the roads you walk be lit by something worth following. Good night, and may you always find yourself worthy of whatever blade is in your hand. End of script. Most Overpowered Kingsguard. In Game of Thrones, Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning extended reflection. The world that made Arthur Dayne, Aerys, Rhaegar, and the Kingsguard in crisis. There is a dimension to Arthur Dayne's story that we have touched on but not fully explored, and it is one that puts his entire legend in a different light. To understand what Arthur was, and what he represented, and why the manner of his life and death carries the weight it does, you need to understand the specific historical moment he existed within. Because the Kingsguard of Aerys II Targaryen was not just any Kingsguard, it was the Kingsguard of a particular crisis, a brotherhood of extraordinary men caught in the progressive deterioration of the institution they served. Watching a king they were sworn to protect become something that no oath to protect could be made comfortable with, and each of them finding different ways to navigate that impossible position. King Aerys II Targaryen had not always been the Mad King. This is a fact that tends to get lost in the narrative, because by the time we encounter him through the eyes of the characters who remember him, he is already the monster. He is already the man who burned people alive. He is already the paranoid, raving figure whose cruelty had shattered the lives of everyone around him, and who would eventually issue the order to burn his own capital city, rather than surrender it to the rebellion closing in around him. but earlier, he had been a different person. Accounts of Aerys in his youth and in the early years of his reign describe someone genuinely promising, charming, intelligent, well-intentioned in the vague way of young rulers who have not yet been fully confronted with the specific moral difficulties of power. He had been the kind of prince who excited hope in the people around him. The tragedy of Aerys is not just that he became terrible. It is that the people who knew him before had seen what he might have been and knew exactly what had been lost. The deterioration was gradual and then sudden, the way these things usually go. The defiance of Duskendale, the crisis where Aerys was captured and held hostage by Lord Dennis Darkland for nearly half a year, where Barristan Selmy ultimately rescued him at considerable personal risk, is usually cited as the inflection point. Whatever Aerys experienced during those months of captivity changed him in ways that never fully healed. The paranoia deepened. The cruelty became less incidental and more systematic. The capacity for ordinary human connection that even difficult rulers tend to retain in some form seems to have been burned away during that captivity, replaced by something stranger and darker. He became obsessed with fire, and with dragonfire specifically, a king without dragons dreaming of the weapons his ancestors had wielded, increasingly convinced that fire was the answer to every problem. The Kingsguard who served him during this deterioration faced an accumulating moral problem that had no clean solution. Their oath was to protect the king's body and to obey his commands. The king's body was being used to hurt people. The king's commands were the orders of a man losing his grip on reality in ways that had lethal consequences for those around him. At what point did obedience to the letter of the oath become complicity in the things that oath was enabling? At what point did the institutional obligation to serve become morally distinguishable from personal choice to participate? Different members of the Kingsguard resolved this differently. Barristan Selmy resolved it by continuing to obey, by suppressing his personal revulsion and maintaining the oath as absolute, and by spending decades afterward haunted by what that choice had cost. Jaime Lannister resolved it by the most extreme possible action, by personally ending the king he was sworn to protect, accepting the eternal shame of Kingslayer as the price of preventing the worst thing the Mad King would otherwise have done. Prince Lewin Martell died on the Trident before the question came fully to its crisis point for him. Oswell Went and Gerald Hightower and Arthur Dayne resolved it by transferring their loyalty to Rhaegar, by treating the crown prince as de facto king while still technically wearing the white cloak, by positioning themselves as servants of what they hoped the future would bring rather than of what the present was. Arthur's choice, the choice to follow Rhaegar's orders to the Tower of Joy rather than return to serve Aerys in his deterioration, was not just a tactical decision about where the best fighter could be most usefully deployed. It was a moral position, a statement acted out rather than spoken, about which version of the Targaryen throne was worth serving. Arthur had looked at Aerys and decided that Rhaegar was the king he was actually following. And in that decision, he demonstrated something about his character that complicated the simple reverence that surrounds his legend. Because choosing Rhaegar was also choosing everything Rhaegar chose. It was choosing the episode with Lyanna Stark, whatever the exact nature of that episode was. It was choosing the policy of isolating a young woman in a mountain tower for the duration of a dangerous pregnancy. It was choosing to stay in Dorne while a war raged that Arthur's presence might have changed, to protect something Rhaegar believed was cosmically important at the cost of everything the war was destroying. Arthur made these choices not because he had no moral agency, but because he had made the judgment that the person he trusted most in the world, his closest friend, the man he had known and competed with and served for decades, was worth following into this particular darkness. This is not simple. This is not the Arthur Dayne of the simple legend, the perfect knight who can do no wrong. This is a human being making real choices with real consequences, whose excellences and whose blind spots were deeply intertwined with each other. His loyalty was what made him great. His loyalty was what made him complicit. The same quality, performing different functions, producing different results. George R. Martin has spoken about this dimension of the story with some care. He has noted that Arthur Dayne is genuinely admirable and genuinely limited, and that both things are true simultaneously. That the greatness of the legend is real, and the complications of the reality are real, and they do not cancel each other out. This is one of the things that makes the world of ice and fire feel like a real world, rather than a fantasy one. The insistence that no person, however exceptional, is made entirely of virtue and no person, however flawed, is made entirely of failure. Extended reflection. Dawn as Lightbringer, the mythological depths. Let us go deeper on the question of Dawn's mythological significance, because this is one of those places where the lore of Game of Thrones requires extended attention in ways that casual engagement doesn't fully capture. The theory that Dawn is Lightbringer, or is connected to Lightbringer, or is the source material from which the Lightbringer legend was drawn, is not a fringe obsession of deep lore fan communities. It is a thread that Martin appears to have deliberately woven into the fabric of the story, whether or not he intends to resolve it explicitly in the final books. Azor Ahai, the figure at the center of the Lord of Light religion's mythology, is described as a hero who forged a sword called Lightbringer to combat the Great Other, the embodiment of cold and darkness, and end the first long night thousands of years ago. The legend of Lightbringer's forging is one of the great mythic sequences in Game of Thrones lore. The hero attempted to forge the sword 3 times. The first 2 times, the sword shattered. The third time, he called his wife Nissa to him and drove the sword through her heart. Her love and her courage and her soul poured into the blade and gave it the burning light that was its defining quality. The sword became a weapon of living fire, a piece of the sun carried in a man's hand, capable of piercing the darkness at the moment of the world's greatest crisis. Now consider Dawn, a blade forged from the heart of a fallen star, from matter that came from somewhere beyond the world, processed through cosmic forces unimaginable in any earthly context, brought to the place where it would become the most significant weapon in the history of a house that took its name from its celestial origin. A pale blade, pale as milk glass, that holds light in its metal. A weapon whose name means the return of light after darkness. A weapon that creates the title Sword of the Morning which is by definition the light that comes back after the night. The thematic resonance between Lightbringer and Dawn is so extensive and so consistent that it seems impossible to attribute to coincidence. Martin works with symbolic systems with enormous care and deliberateness. The choice to give House Dayne a star-forged sword with a name that means the dawn and a title that means the holder of the morning light is not random decoration. It is a statement about the relationship between this weapon and the deep mythological structures of the world. The most sophisticated version of the theory does not simply say Dawn is Lightbringer and Arthur was Azor Ahai. It says something more interesting, that the mythological truth of Lightbringer and the material reality of Dawn may be related in the way that legends and their historical sources are always related, imperfectly, through the distortion of thousands of years of oral transmission and deliberate reinterpretation, but with a real underlying connection. The actual event that the Lightbringer legend is based on may have involved something like dawn, or dawn may be the weapon that will become Lightbringer in the final confrontation with the darkness, if a worthy bearer claims it. Or the legend of Azor Ahai may be a garbled memory of the first Dayne and the first Sword of the Morning, transformed by centuries of religious elaboration into a myth of cosmic proportions. What this means for Arthur Dayne specifically is that he may have been carrying, without knowing it, one of the deep mythological objects of his world. The sword on his back may have been connected to the most fundamental questions about light and darkness, winter and spring, the survival of the world. When Ned Stark picked up Dawn from the ground next to Arthur's dying body at the Tower of Joy and carried it to Starfall, he was carrying something that the Daynes and the Lord of Light priests, and perhaps the children of the forest themselves, would have recognized as significant in ways that went far beyond the immediate personal tragedy of a great knight's death. Whether this significance ever gets resolved in the novels, whether the sleeping sword of the morning ever wakes again, and the pale blade ever goes back into active service against the darkness, remains one of the great unanswered questions in the unfinished portion of Martin's story. But the question itself gives Arthur Dayne's story a resonance that extends beyond the political drama of Robert's rebellion, beyond even the personal tragedy of a great man's death. It connects him to the oldest stories in the world, to the turning of seasons and the long battle between light and cold, to a mythology that the people of Westeros built over 10,000 years to make sense of why the world keeps turning and why winter keeps ending. The Sword of the Morning, Dawn, the heart of a fallen star, the light that comes back. Extended reflection, the living legacy, how Arthur Dayne shaped Jon Snow's world. There is one final thread that deserves attention before we close, and it is perhaps the most extraordinary one. The connection between Arthur Dayne's last stand and Jon Snow's existence is not incidental. It is structural. It is, in a certain sense, the entire point. Arthur Dayne died at the Tower of Joy to protect a child. That child grew up as Jon Snow of Winterfell, the bastard son of Eddard Stark, the Night's Watch Ranger, the King in the North, the person who may be the most important living individual in the world of Game of Thrones at the point where the main story ends. Jon Snow exists. His identity, his survival through the years of his childhood, his ability to develop the character and skills that made him who he is. Because Ned Stark promised a dying woman he would keep her son safe, and because Ned Stark was the kind of man who kept impossible promises. And Ned Stark made that promise in the tower, with Dawn in his hand, standing over the body of the greatest knight he ever saw. The connection is direct and intimate. Arthur Dayne's death, and Ned's survival of it, and Ned's entry into the tower, and Ned's agreement to protect the child, this entire sequence is the event that made Jon Snow possible. Without Arthur standing at that door and forcing the confrontation to happen in the way it did, the secret might have been discovered or handled differently. Without Ned's specific survival, the survival that depended on Howland Reed's intervention, that Arthur's excellence had almost prevented, the child's true identity might have emerged or might have been suppressed in different ways. The exact circumstances of Arthur Dayne's last stand shaped the exact shape of the secret that determined Jon Snow's entire life. Jon Snow, in everything he became, in his leadership of the Night's Watch, in his death and resurrection, in his role in the wars against the White Walkers, in the final revelation of his true parentage, carries within him the consequence of Arthur Dayne's choice to stand at that door. Arthur never knew the child. Arthur never knew what Jon Snow would become. He was protecting something he believed was important on the orders of a man he trusted, and he died without knowing whether his sacrifice had served any purpose that would outlast the immediate moment. But the purpose was real, and it outlasted the moment by decades, and its full significance is still being felt in the world of the story. The finest knight who ever lived died in service of something that turned out to matter in ways he could not have predicted, which is, perhaps, the most hopeful version of what it means to do your duty faithfully. Not that you will see the outcome, not that you will understand the full context, not that your sacrifice will be recognized or rewarded, but that the thing you protected will turn out to have been worth protecting. Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, gave his life at the Tower of Joy for a child who would one day be called the Prince that was promised. Whether or not that prophecy is literally true in the final telling of the story, the shape of what Arthur chose to do with his last act, to stand his ground in service of something larger than himself, to protect rather than conquer, to give rather than take, has the quality of the best things that people do. The quality of the morning, after the long dark. The pale sword is waiting, the world is still turning. The story is not finished yet. And somewhere at Starfall, in the White Sword Tower by the mouth of the Torrentine, where the river meets the sea beneath the castle named for a falling star, dawn is still pale as milk glass, still alive with light, still waiting for the next night worthy enough to carry it forward into whatever morning comes next. Final extended script, most overpowered Kingsguard. In Game of Thrones, Sir Arthur Dayne, total content, extended version with all sections and reflections, final thoughts, why the Sword of the Morning still matters. There is something worth saying, before we close entirely, about why a character who appears on screen for less than 5 minutes in the whole of Game of Thrones has generated the kind of ongoing fascination that Arthur Dayne generates. Why, years after the show ended, long after the discourse has moved on to other subjects, the figure of the Sword of the Morning remains one of the most compelling reference points in the entire franchise. Why his name keeps coming up in conversations about what Game of Thrones was actually about, underneath all the political intrigue and the shocking deaths and the dragons. The reason, I think, is that Arthur Dayne represents something the story is fundamentally about finding and then losing. He represents the ideal, not an idealized character with no flaws. We have talked about the complications and the limitations and the ways in which even Arthur's goodness was entangled with the broken institutions of his world. But the ideal of what human excellence looks like when it is allowed to fully develop, when circumstances align with character and produce something extraordinary and unmistakable. When you see it, you know it. That is what Ned Stark felt looking at Arthur. That is what Jaime felt the day Arthur knighted him. That is what the people of the Kingswood felt when the knight who came to deal with the outlaws started paying for what his forces took and petitioning the king on their behalf. Game of Thrones is, in its deepest structure, a story about the world's tendency to destroy its best things. The Starks, who represent honor and straightforwardness in a world that punishes both. The Targaryens, who carried genuine gifts and genuine potential that were repeatedly consumed by the madness and the cost of their own nature. Rhaegar himself, who had probably the clearest vision of any individual in the story about what needed to happen and why, and who died in a river because he could not translate that vision into the kind of organizational support that would have given him a chance to realize it. And Arthur Dayne, who was in some ways the purest expression of what a good person in a Westerosi context could look like, and who died because he was loyal to someone who asked him to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is not nihilism. Martin is not saying that goodness is pointless or that excellence is futile. He is saying something more complicated and ultimately more true, that goodness matters enormously but does not protect itself, that excellence creates value in the world but cannot guarantee its own preservation, that the best things people do and are often don't come with the outcomes those things deserve, and the world keeps turning anyway, and the things that were done in goodness continue to have effects even after the good person is gone. Arthur Dayne died at the Tower of Joy. The child he died protecting grew up and became one of the most important people in the realm. Ned Stark carried the sword back to Starfall and returned it with the kind of respect that recognized what Arthur had been, and that gesture of respect meant something to the people who received it. The standard that Arthur set, for Jaime, for Barristan, for everyone who knew him or heard his name, continued to exert pressure on the world long after the man himself was gone. The Pale Blade sits in the tower and waits, and the waiting is itself a kind of statement about standards that the world has not stopped needing, even when it produces no one adequate to them. The Sword of the Morning, the finest knight who ever lived, a man born from the shadow of a falling star, who carried that celestial inheritance into everything he did, who brought something of the light of the morning into a world that had more than enough darkness to offer, who stood at the end of everything he had ever known and refused to move, not because he believed he could win, but because he had made a promise and the promise was worth keeping. We talk about Arthur Dayne because we need to remember what the standard is. Because in a story full of people falling short of their best selves, in a world that constantly produces reasons to compromise and calculate and let the ideal slip a little further out of reach, the memory of the Sword of the Morning is the reminder of what is possible, not easy, not guaranteed, not safe, but possible, if you decide that the thing you are protecting matters enough to stand in front of. That is the legacy of Sir Arthur Dayne. Not the victories, not the legendary blade, not even the extraordinary skill. The willingness to stand at the door, in the knowledge that standing costs everything, because what is behind the door is worth the price of standing. Good night. The pale sword waits at starfall, patient as starlight. Patient as the morning that always, without exception, follows the dark. The story of Sir Arthur Dayne is not finished yet, because the things he protected and the standard he set are still alive in the world he left behind. Dawn waits. The Sword of the Morning waits. The world turns toward whatever morning comes next. And somewhere, in a library, or a dark room, or a quiet corner of a long evening, someone is hearing this name for the first time. Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning. And understanding, in the way you understand the really important things, that this is a story worth knowing. That this is a life worth following from beginning to end. That the finest knight who ever lived in the world of Westeros is the finest precisely because his greatness was not just in what he could do, but in how and why and in whose service he chose to do it. That is the story. That is the morning the title promises, and it is worth every moment of the dark that comes before it.